Hello, students. Welcome back to recorded lectures. This is my second effort, so hopefully this one will be even better. So, today we're going to talk about Durkheim, and I love Durkheim. And I know this was kind of a weird reading because it was 4 different readings sort of cobbled together into one, but it's put together that way for a pretty good reason, which is to say that these are the best and most important ideas that he had about labor, and it seemed like a good idea just to read a little bit rather than to read all of the original works. So essentially, all that I gave you was the highlights. So let's start, like we always do, by talking about the author. So this is Emile Durkheim. So he was French. His last name is German, of course, but there was some overlap. And he was important sort of historically because he basically invented sociology, which is very helpful. I appreciate it. So he was a lifelong academic. His father was also pretty well educated, which is, of course, becoming a theme. And so his primary sort of contribution to society was bringing science into the social sciences. So he lived, as you can see, right at the sort of climax of the Industrial Revolution. So he was born, in the late 1850s and lived until the early 1900s. So he was alive during like a really crucial part of humanity, these really big social changes. And he was one of the people who was trying to explain not just how did the Industrial Revolution change jobs or change wages, both of which we've already seen. He was trying to explain how it changed society. So he is essentially talking about the same stuff as the other authors we've read, except that he's talking about feelings. So Durkheim's undergraduate education was in France, where he was studying the humanities, and actually he wrote his thesis on Montesquieu, which will sound familiar to some of you. So while he was studying the humanities, he got sort of annoyed by the lack of science, by the lack of like facts. He was studying, philosophy and psychology and that sort of thing, but he was like, maybe we should focus on things that we can, count, things that we can like definitively look at instead of just sitting around theorizing. So he moved to Germany, and he studied sociology there, even though sociology wasn't quite a science yet, like it was just sort of beginning to be invented. So basically, in Germany, he was able to study with the people who were like in the process of inventing the concept of applying science to humanity. So when he finished his doctorate in Germany, he moved back to France and sort of climbed the academic ladder. So, he started as a professor, and then he became a chair of a department, and then he became the chair of several departments. And so basically, he brought sociology from Germany to France and made it like a whole thing. His life was actually very normal, not a very exciting dude. He came from a long line of rabbis, but he himself was never religious. He worked with a lot of Jewish people, and that will become important later. Hold on. But he himself was largely secular. He married and had 2 kids. He lived, in the city where he taught. Like everything was pretty standard, really up until World War One. And so he was a known leftist. So he wasn't as far left as Marx or anything like that, but he was, sort of known to be liberal. He was known to be anti-fascist. And during World War One, it became a real problem because a lot of the like heavily right-wing forces took over in the French Academy and took over in the French cities, and so his leftist leanings became like a political problem. So during World War One, his only son was killed fighting, and he sort of never recovered from that. And then he lost his job because he was openly anti-fascist, which these days we look back at and we're like, yes. But in those days, it was considered kind of dangerous. So he basically lost his son, he lost his career, and he just sort of never recovered. He died shortly thereafter from a stroke. But it's sort of one of those things that people look at and say, maybe he died from like a broken heart, like everything was wrong. So here are his most famous published works. We are reading that very first one, The Division of Labor in Society. And that one came from actually his dissertation. After he finished his dissertation and became a professor, he turned it into a book, which is always a good thing to do. In 1895, he did Rules for Sociological Method, which we'll talk about in a second. Basically, it's sort of outlining this burgeoning science. In 1897, he wrote this book called On Suicide, which is not nearly as dark as it sounds. Basically, it was the first, sort of sociological examination of something that we think of as deeply personal. It's an excellent book. If you go into sociology, you'll read it. And then there was, sort of a break in major publishing until 1912, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, which was about how people tend to organize themselves socially on religious lines. Even though the religions are all sort of fundamentally similar, people extrapolate, sort of social qualities from what religion you follow. And this is something that you probably have still seen. So I wanted to tell you about this briefly just because it sounds so logical, but this was brand new thought at the time. So when he was writing this work about sociological methodology, this is what he said, that essentially when you are doing sociology, you have to have a specific object of study. So you're basically concentrating on facts. You're concentrating on one fact. With philosophy and with psychology, people at that time were sort of rambling around. Like, a lot of the books that we've read are just sort of one guy's thoughts on like the universe. And so he was saying, no, when we do science, we need to focus on one thing. And also, very importantly, number two, you have to apply the scientific method. So essentially, we are looking at facts and we are studying them scientifically. And this was a brand new way to study humans. For the most part, people just sort of, sat around in their togas and talked big ideas. And he was the first person to say, like, no, we need to measure it. We need to have a hypothesis. We need to test it. We need to, apply the scientific method that I'm sure you remember from middle school. And we need to be subjective. So essentially, we need to be objective. So when you are being subjective, it means that you apply your own biases to it. And when you are being objective, it means that you don't. You look at it completely without bias. And he was the first person to say we need to look at society without bias. And as it turned out, it was very useful, and we all like it very much. So here is his most famous quote regarding this. Only by comparing does one explain. Thus, a scientific investigation cannot achieve its ends unless it is concerned with facts that can be compared. And the more it is assured of having collected all those facts that can be usefully compared, the more likely it is to succeed. So again, this sounds like sort of basic scientific knowledge. Like you're probably reading this and thinking like, yes, that's how we do science. But it's very important to write these things down. You know how I'm always saying the first white guy to write something down is the one who gets to name it. So this is a great example of that. He basically said, if we want to study something, we need facts. We need as many facts as possible, and then we have to compare those facts. So that was his major contribution. So what we are going to look at today is how he used this method to think about work and to think about the ways that work and jobs and labor had just dramatically changed in the world around him. Okay, so as I said, the book that we're reading is called The Division of Labor and Society, but since we're not reading the whole book, we're just going to focus on mostly chapter 6, which is about not just the division of labor, but social differentiation. So we are reading 2 sections from chapter 6. This is the first one, The Growth of Structural Differentiation and Social Development. This is a pretty boring title, but I promise we'll break it down. Okay. So Durkheim's primary concern was what he called social solidarity. So social solidarity to him was basically about how connected and interconnected members of society were. So if you remember in the beginning of the semester, we talked about how basically everybody used to live on farms and they used to live in villages, and you knew everybody in your town, and you always had. All of you were very similar. You were all, the same race and ethnicity and religion. But now people are moving into cities and they're surrounded by all these weird, different people. And so what he's concerned with is how that's working out, how we're supposed to all get along when we're surrounded by people that don't look anything like us and don't have the same sort of concerns that we have. So basically, he's trying to work out how the Industrial Revolution, which made all of us move to cities, also changed our social lives. So he divides the way that we get along into 2 categories. So he calls it mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. And this has always bothered me because I always thought it should be the other way around. So if you are confused about this, trust me, we have all been confused about this for decades. But basically, mechanical solidarity is the sort of old school version, where the members of society are really homogenous. They do a lot of the same work, like everybody's a farmer, or everybody's Protestant, or everybody is Welsh, or, whatever. Basically, you live in a village with a lot of people who are exactly like you. The new version he calls organic solidarity, which again, why? Seems like they should be the other way around, but whatever. So this one is a lot more heterogeneous. heterogeneous. I always get that one wrong. And it's more sort of interdependent. So everybody has different jobs, but that means that we are actually dependent on one another to do those jobs. So in the olden days, the same person, could butcher the cow and bake the loaf of bread. But in the new version of society, the butcher and the baker are dependent upon each other because they both only know how to do their job. So the new version of society, this organic version, everyone is different, but at the same time, everyone needs each other in a way that we used to not. So keep these two in mind because these are going to come up later. So when he's talking about the mechanical version of society, the old way, what he argues is that people in a society like this have to resemble one another. He says for segmental organization to be possible, the segments must resemble one another. Without that, they would not be united. So he looks sort of historically at all of these like tribes and clans and hordes, which is, kind of low-key racist, but whatever. So he's basically looking at all these ancient societies where everybody was blood related, or at least, a couple of generations back, and the way that that sort of held them together. Like they had these fundamental similarities. Organic society, on the other hand, everybody is different. And it's important that they're different because they are all bringing their differences together to sort of become stronger. He argues these are formed not by the repetition of similar homogeneous segments, but by a system of different organs, each of which has a special role and which are themselves formed of differentiated parts. So one way I think that is helpful to think about this is sort of like in those crime caper movies, there's that montage where everybody has a different skill, but then they all come together and make like a stronger team. I think it's sort of like that. Maybe sort of like Care Bears, like everybody has a different special power, but when they come together, it's all magical. So this is kind of what he's talking about. So people are not similar, but by sort of combining their own strengths, they become stronger. So the problem with a bunch of people being different from one another is that automatically, as humans, we try to rank each other. So it's not enough for us to be different but equal. We have to be different but in a hierarchy. So he argues not only are the social elements not of the same nature, but they are not distributed in the same way. They are not juxtaposed in a linear fashion, but coordinated and subordinated to one another. So we don't all exist on the same sort of level playing field. It isn't linear. It's much more hierarchical. We have all different jobs, and for some reason we are obsessed with ranking those jobs. Who is the most important? Who is the least important? Now that we're all different, we have to figure out where we fit in the like sort of order of society. And this can be dangerous because the problem with ranking is that very often the people who are on top hold down the people who are on the bottom, which is something that Marx talked about pretty extensively last week, so this should sound familiar. This is kind of an example of that, and this is a little bit silly, but of course they all are. So on the left, we have a bunch of cater waiters, and if you are, a member of a cater waiter team, you are all equal. No one cater waiter is better than the other ones. You're kind of all the same. Like Man Bun is in the front there, but he's not better than the other ones. Whereas on the right, we have members of a hotel staff. And as you can see by their different outfits, they are ranked. Some of them have more power than others. Some of them get paid more than others. That one white lady is in the front, but I think it's safe to assume the guy to the back and right of her is probably in charge. And you can sort of tell how they rank by the differentiation of their outfits and by the differentiation in the perceived value of their labor. So on the left, we have mechanical solidarity. On the right, we have organic solidarity. So now he starts to think about the ways that our jobs determine our social rank. Like if we're going to be, existing in a hierarchy, how do we decide who is in what space? So this is what he says. In this type, and he's talking about the organic solidarity, individuals are no longer grouped according to their relations of lineage, but according to the particular nature of the social activity to which they devote themselves. Their natural and necessary milieu is no longer that given by birth, but that given by occupation. So, if you've ever seen, the sort of standard American greeting at parties where you say, "Oh, what do you do?" This is an example of that. This idea that the work that you do is the defining thing about you. So it no longer matters where you're from or who your family is. Now the only thing that matters is the nature of the social activity to which you devote yourself. So essentially, if you're trying to figure out who somebody is, the first thing you want to know about them is what their job is. And again, this is very normal in American society. This probably does not sound unusual to you. I guess the college version of this might be like, what is your major? So you're trying to assess information about a person with one piece of information. And in the olden days, you could guess a lot about a person by who their family was. But in this more modern version of society, you don't know their family. You don't know who these people are. So if you're trying to figure out, what about their wealth? What about their traditions? What about their, view on society? You are trying to assess that from one piece of information, and the more current, relevant piece of information is, okay, but what is your job? And that tells us everything else we need to know. So Durkheim is basically recognizing this shift. It doesn't matter anymore who your family is. It matters now what you do. In a general way, classes and castes probably derive their origin and their character in this way. They arise from the numerous occupational organizations which spring up within pre-existing familial organization. So there can be sort of a combination, this idea that your family determines your job. And this is something that we were kind of looking at with your first paper. Very often, for instance, the children of doctors become doctors, or the children of lawyers become lawyers, or the children of factory workers become factory workers. So your job is still an important aspect of you, but it might be determined by your pre-existing familial organization, which is to say it might be determined by what your family does, and therefore what you are able to achieve educationally, or what you think you can achieve in terms of your occupation. So kind of both can be true. And again, this is exactly what we were looking at in your first paper. The substance of social life must enter into entirely new combinations in order to organize itself upon completely different foundations. But the old structure, so far as it persists, is opposed to this. That is why it must disappear. So he's arguing that, yeah, the importance of your family is still around, but it is becoming ever less important. And this is true. Like, if you think about the people that you know right now, you probably don't know what their parents do. You probably don't know who their parents are. When you go out into the world and you're trying to make new friends or date new people, you might not ask about their parents at all. You know what I mean? Because that's just not something that we consider to be as valid anymore. And his argument is that starting now, and now being, late 1800s, that won't be important anymore. We don't need to know who your daddy is and what he does. Right now, what we need to know is, what is your job? So let's move into the decline of mechanical solidarity and the emergence of moral individualism. So these readings are organized in a pattern, I promise. They're sort of a through line. So we talked first about the way that society used to be organized and how it's changing. So we'll talk now about the change, like what has been the result of that change. So we know now that we have a much more organic solidarity, and that's going to change the way we think about the individual. So essentially, not only in a general way does mechanical solidarity link men less strongly than organic solidarity, but also, as we advance in the scale of social evolution, it becomes increasingly weak. So here he's saying that the interdependent bonds that exist in organic solidarity, which remember is the modern one, are actually more powerful than the sort of familial bonds that existed in mechanical solidarity. So his argument is that society is actually tied closer together in this new network of interdependent individual humans. That basically we used to be held together by our blood bonds, but now we are held together by our interdependent, sort of economic bonds. And he's arguing that that's actually stronger. So what he uses to argue that this is stronger is a very big picture idea. And this is a little bit complicated because it doesn't translate easily. So he calls it the conscience collective. But probably when you've heard of this, you've heard of it as the collective unconscious. So basically what he's talking about is this idea that there are thoughts and like norms and morals that are shared by everybody. And they might not be something that we talk about out loud, but basically it's sort of this society-wide system of beliefs. So the way that it translates is real tricky, and very often people translate it differently. So you might think of it as sort of a shared conscience, but that's not the conscience like the angel and devil on your shoulder. It's the conscience like being awake, like the opposite of unconscious, like you're the opposite of being in a coma. So it's sort of this consciousness might be easier to say about it, or the sort of like perception. So these like social beliefs that we sort of all share. So one, again, silly example would be when I say football, what do you think? The rest of the world thinks of what we think of as soccer, but Americans think of American football. So essentially, our collective conscience says that the word football means, the one where you have the hand egg, for lack of a better term, and you tackle each other and run around. And literally everyone else thinks of the version where you have a little ball and you kick it with your feet. So this is kind of an interesting example of the way that we all believe something, even if we're not necessarily aware of what we believe. And there's a lot of great examples of this, like how close you stand to somebody is determined by your conscience collective. Like different societies stand closer or further away. What you think is correct to eat for breakfast is a really interesting example of this. In other societies, they're straight up horrified by the idea of fried eggs for breakfast. How you raise your children. Like there's a million examples, but basically it's this idea that as a society, we have shared beliefs, and that's going to be important later on. So this is another, sort of explanation of this. Because we have these shared beliefs, as society changes, those beliefs change. So in the olden days, for instance, we all believed, that like leeches would cure what was wrong with you. But these days, we believe that that is very strange and you should leave your blood inside your body. So as society changes, our conscience collective changes. Our ideas about religion change, our ideas about politics change, our ideas about norms change. If you have ever gone in for a handshake and received a fist bump instead, you're familiar with this idea. Our ideas about what is normal change sometimes when we're not looking. You'll find out. One day you'll be an old person and you'll be like, oh no, things changed without me. It can be very confusing. So for Durkheim, he wants to outline the ways that it's changing, and because he's trying to apply scientific method to social facts, he numbers them and he names them. This is very important for science, of course. So these are the three things that he believes really impact the way that our conscious collective is changing. First, the relation between the volume of the conscious collective and that of the individual mind. So essentially, how much room in your brain is taken up by the conscious collective versus how much room in your brain is taken up by your own ideas. Second, the intensity of the states of the conscious collective, like how intensely you believe the things that you're being told by society. And third, the greater or lesser the fixity of these states and the place they leave for individual differences. So third assumes that you have some aspects of the conscious collective in your brain, but this is how flexible are those things. Is there room for negotiation? Is there room for individual difference? So let's go through and essentially look at them in more detail. Number one, the volume. So here, he's not just worried about is the collective conscious in your brain. He assumes it's there. He's worried about how loud it is. Is this sort of groupthink determining your choices? Is it determining your actions? How strong, essentially, is the link between what society says you should do and what you ultimately choose to do? And so I think one example of this is the degree to which both sides of the political spectrum believe that the other side of the political spectrum is controlled by the media. So there's this sort of idea that, for instance, in the upcoming presidential election, that we are choosing our president based on what the TV tells us to do. Whether you watch, Fox News or MSNBC or something like that, like this idea that your primary guiding source is something that is external to you, that you're not making up your own decisions, you're just kind of doing what society says that you should do. The second version is how intense that message from society is. So yes, you're getting a message, and yes, it might be taking up a lot of room in your brain, but is it powerful? Is it more powerful than your individual decision making? Is the collective conscience so strong that even though you want to do something else, you do what the collective conscience says you should do? So I think sort of one famous example of this is that in the 80s and 90s, people started to think that there were just more gay people running around. And the truth was that there had always been this amount of gay people. They were just pretending to be straight. So historically, for instance, a lot of people have known that they were gay, but the collective conscience says, no, you can't do that. So they entered into heterosexual marriages. So this is kind of an example of how intense that message is. Do you know that something is true about yourself, but you also know that you have to hide it? That means that the collective conscience is stronger than your individual conscience. And finally, the fixity. So fixity essentially means how fixed it is, which right makes sense. So here it's the idea of how solid are these beliefs? Is there any room for negotiation? Like if you go into a store that says no shirt, no shoes, no service, do that like does it mean that? Like can you try going in without shoes? Can you go in without pants? Like how strict are these rules? So for instance, you know that you have to wear a cap and gown at graduation, but can you decorate the top of your hat? You know, can you wear a different colored gown? Like how much room is there for this sort of thing? Like you're willing to follow the beliefs and traditions of your people, but is there like wiggle room? So essentially, when you look at these three things together, we're looking at how strong the social messages are. And in mechanical societies, those messages are very strong. You only do that which your society says that you can do. In organic societies, these messages become increasingly weak, and the individual becomes a little bit more stronger than the group. And so that's the big social change that's happening, this idea that you might not have to do what the group says you should do. Now, as a quick aside, the Conscience Collective is not always bad. One of the things that the Conscience Collective does is that it tells us what we believe to be good and what we believe to be bad, and knowing what we believe to be bad is very important. It's how we determine what should be illegal, it's how we determine which people should be in jail, and sometimes it's kind of fuzzy. So I think the most famous example of this is when they were trying to decide the Supreme Court was trying to decide if it should be legal to mail pornography using the U.S. Postal Service. And the Justice Stewart said that essentially he doesn't know how to define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And this is a great example, I think, that sometimes we don't know what is bad, but when we see it, we know it. Like we may not be able to define it, but when we see it, we know it. And these things can change, right? Like 2 months ago, buying a whole shopping cart full of toilet paper was considered, kind of weird, but not bad. But these days, buying a whole shopping cart full of toilet paper is considered antisocial. Like, why are you doing that, Karen? Like, the rest of us need toilet paper too. So this idea that having a shared idea of what is bad is important is solid. Like, sometimes we need to know what we consider to be bad. Sometimes that's how we decide who is dangerous or how we decide what is dangerous. So it's not all bad. So the thing that Durkheim's really concerned with is the rise of the individual. So we've talked about the ways that society can control what we believe to be important, and now we're talking about whether the individual can sort of override that code. Like, can you look at what society said and still decide to be your own person? So that's the kind of major social change that's happening in the middle of this industrial revolution. So he argues that yes, society is very powerful, but one of the big changes that's coming with moving to cities and getting new jobs and leaving your family is that the individual becomes stronger than society. If there are more things common to all, there are far more things that are personal to each. So yes, we have a lot of things in common, but he argues that we have more things that are personal, that are individual, that make us, special and unique. It is therefore, at least probably that in each individual mind, the personal sphere has grown more than the other. In any case, the relation between them has at most remained the same. So it's sort of like if you had, a power bar for individuality and a power bar for, social norms. The power bar exists for social norms. Like you maybe still, it reaches up, you maybe have 3 of those, but the power bar for the individual mind is much stronger. It's just getting bigger every day. So yes, we still care about the rest of society, but increasingly we care about us. So that doesn't mean that the collective society is gone. It just means that now we have to make room for differences. This is not to say, however, that the conscious collective is likely to disappear completely. Rather, it comes to consist of very general and indeterminate ways of thought and sentiment, which leaves room for a growing variety of individual differences. So it's not that we're just like, going nuts and we're all doing very weird things. It's just that we're starting to do slightly different things. So we're all still Spider-Man. It's just that we are different versions of Spider-Man. We are different Spider-Men, spiders, men. I have no idea. Okay. We're still all Spider-Man. We just have slightly different Spider-Man costumes. How's that? So we're still existing within these sort of norms, but there's a little bit of change now. We're starting to look a little bit different. And this means that we value those differences. Previously, we thought those differences were bad. Anybody who's a little bit different in society was kind of a weirdo. But now we're starting to think, oh, maybe being different is cool. Maybe that makes us individual. Maybe that makes us sort of special. There is even a place where it is strengthened and made precise. This is in the way in which it regards the individual. As all the other beliefs and all the other practices take on a less and less religious character, the individual becomes the object of a sort of religion. We have a cult of personal dignity. So this is it, man. This is that big, like, Western shift. If you think about one of the major differences between, sort of, quote, Eastern and Western philosophy, very often in the East, the family is the most important thing, and in the West, the individual is the most important thing. And this is one of the places where that shift began. Basically, we used to be concerned with the whole, and now we are concerned with one. A cult of personal dignity, this idea that the individual has value and that you should listen to yourself alone. Again, this probably doesn't sound weird to you because Americans are so obsessed with individuality, but this is where it began. We can then conclude by saying that all social links which result from such likeness progressively slacken. So we used to be like this little fish. We're hanging out with all the other fish who look like us. But then one day we realized we are an orange fish and we can just be an orange fish. We can just go on our own path. So that's kind of what's happening. We used to run in groups that were just like us, but now we're like, hold up, I can be an individual. It's okay for me to be an individual. It's powerful for me to be an individual. And we can start, swimming in an entirely different direction. Okay. So now we move to a different section of article. So this one is essentially a response to someone else. So in academia, it's considered sort of polite if somebody writes a review of your work, or if somebody writes something very similar to your work, you will be invited to write a response. So this is, sort of how we have academic beefs, I guess you could say, in the journals. So the Revue Philosophique gave Durkheim the sort of option to respond to Toennies. It's a very German name that has an umlaut over the O, so forgive me. But Toennies wrote a piece called Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. So here is Ferdinand Toennies. And he was a German philosopher who was sort of also in the process of inventing sociology. So during this whole sort of shift from the humanities to the social sciences, he was one of the people who was on the forefront of that movement. So he was teaching in Germany at the time, and he invented the same sort of idea that society itself was changing, that it was going from one model to another model. And very similar to Durkheim's organic and mechanical solidarity, he invented one, but he called it Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. You might see these words again later, especially if you go into sociology, because a lot of people use his terms instead of Durkheim's terms. So Gemeinschaft is very similar to mechanic solidarity. It's sort of the original. It has a lot to do with like community and your family, your neighborhood, like the people who are similar to you in a lot of ways. It's the more homogenous one. Gesellschaft, on the other hand, is the more modern one. There's a much more of a focus on individualism. There's a lot of talk about like the government instead of the family. So Gesellschaft is the one that's similar to organic solidarity. So where they differ is this idea of whether this change is a bad change. Toennies argue that it was unnatural, that we shouldn't have society like that we shouldn't be so individualistic, that we shouldn't value the individual over the family. And Durkheim argued that it was okay to value the individual. So what they talk about, or rather what Durkheim talks about in this article, is yes, we agree that society has changed, but some of us think that that's going to be okay. So Durkheim said, outside of these purely individual actions, there is the collective activity in our contemporary societies, which is just as natural as that of the smaller societies of previous ages. It is certainly different. It constitutes a distinct type, but however different they may be, there is no difference in nature between these two varieties of the same genus. So essentially, he's like, yes, it's different, but it doesn't mean it's unnatural. It doesn't mean that we haven't had change previously. It's just that this is a change we hadn't seen yet. So Durkheim asks, is it likely, moreover, that the evolution of a single entity, society, begins by being organic only to subsequently become purely mechanical? So his concept here is like, yeah, does it seem correct to you that we would start organic and become mechanical? Like, does that seem like the only option? And he says, we have to choose. If society is originally a natural phenomenon, it stays such until the end of its life. So he's arguing that this too is natural. It's natural for society to change. It's natural for the individual to change. It's natural for our goals and our ideas and our norms to change. So just because it's different doesn't mean that it's unnatural. Like he's arguing that's kind of the wrong way to think about it. So he is much like this very comforting bulldog. Yes, things are changing, but no, we're not ruining humanity. This is a very common refrain that, if you read history or you read philosophy, you'll hear over and over again. This idea that like, oh, we're ruining humanity, and like, oh, this is the end. Oh, the young people, they're going to destroy us. So it happens, every generation. And Durkheim is saying like, yes, this is a change, but like, calm yourself. We're going to be okay. So now we move into another response, and this is also from that same journal, the philosophical journal, Revue Philosophique. And in this one, Durkheim is once again responding to attacks on his philosophy, but this time he's responding to attacks specifically about individualism. Again, we're coming from a sort of mindset that the society is more important than the individual and shifting to a mindset that the individual is more important than society. So basically, people have been critiquing the social change. They've been critiquing Durkheim by saying that the kind of individualism that he's talking about is dangerous because it's transactional. So what they mean by that is that we're entering into a society where people are only interested in what you can do for them. There's no more giving for the sake of giving. There's no more, supporting your family just because that's what you do. It's more like, yeah, well, what's in it for me? And Durkheim says, number one, that's not the kind of individualism we're talking about. And number two, the kind of individualism he's talking about isn't bad. So Durkheim says, it is not hard, to be sure, to denounce as a shallow ideal that narrow commercialism which reduces society to nothing more than a vast apparatus of production and exchange. And it is perfectly clear that all social life would be impossible if there did not exist interests superior to the interest of the individuals. So he's saying, yes, it would be terrible if society were purely transactional. And yes, it would be terrible that social life would essentially disappear because there would be nothing more than the interest of the individual. But it is wholly correct that such doctrine should be treated as anarchical, which is, he's saying like, yeah, you're not wrong, that would be terrible. And we fully agree with this view. But what is unacceptable is that this individualism should be presented as the only one that there is or even could be. So he's saying, yes, that's a definition of individualism, but that's not the only definition. Maybe we should think of individualism a little bit differently. However, there exists another individualism over which it is less easy to triumph. It has been upheld for a century by the greatest majority of thinkers. It is the individualism of Kant and Rousseau and the spiritualists, that which the Declaration of the Rights of Man sought. So, remember how I always say that core comes back around and back to core? Here it is. This is the kind of individualism that we talked about in Rousseau. This is the kind of individualism that we read about last semester with Locke and with Montesquieu and with all these people who were trying to argue that an individual has rights, that an individual has the same sort of value that we used to give to, kings, that every individual is special and unique and deserves a sort of base level of respect. So he's saying the individualism you're talking about sucks and is bad. The individualism I'm talking about could actually be positive for society. So he is talking about the kind of individualism that we think of today, the one where we have inalienable rights, the one where we have justice under the law. So essentially a different twist on individualism. So one example that Durkheim gives of treating the individual as an individual is recognizing their circumstances. And one example of that is this idea that people who commit crimes are not all the same. So here he's talking about immoral conduct, and he's saying we can't necessarily treat every single crime as the same crime because we don't know what's going on in sort of the background of that individual. Hence, immoral conduct is to be recognized by the sign that it is closely linked to the individuality of the agent and cannot be universalized without manifest absurdity. So, for instance, here we have Aladdin. He's saying that it's different for poor street beggar Aladdin to steal a loaf of bread than it would be for rich Prince Ali Baba to steal a loaf of bread. That basically we have to recognize individuality of the agent, which is to say we have to recognize circumstances. So giving those two people the same penalty for stealing a loaf of bread would be, quote, manifest absurdity. That one of the values of recognizing the individual is recognizing that their different circumstances predict their different actions and that therefore they should predict their different punishments. Thus, for both of these thinkers, the only modes of conduct that are moral are those which are applicable to all men equally. That is to say, which are implied in the notion of man in general. So, yes, we have to all be subject to the same laws and morals, but also we have to recognize that everyone deserves being subject to the same laws and morals. So yes, we have to punish both people who stole a loaf of bread, but we also have to recognize that their motives are different, that their circumstances are different, and that you can't get away with crime because you're powerful, but neither can you be punished similarly because you are not powerful. So this is, again, a very American ideal, this idea that everyone is subject to the same laws and morals, and because of that, every individual has value. So that's essentially what he's talking about here, that individuality can be good and it can be useful for society. Nowhere are the rights of man affirmed more energetically since the individual is here placed on the level of sacrosanct objects. Nowhere is he more jealously protected from external encroachments, whatever the source. So a sacrosanct object is very often we think of as like a religious object, something like worth worshiping. So he's arguing that in this system of individuality, the individual is valuable, the individual is protected, the individual has rights, he has protections, he has equality, and that this kind of individualism is helpful, is useful, is the kind of thing that we need to move society forward. So he does recognize that some of these old values were good, and in these old values here, when he's talking about our forerunners, he's talking about the guys that we read last semester, that at that point in like the 1750s. Our forerunners were concerned solely with freeing the individual from the political shackles which hampered his development. Thus, they regarded the freedom of thought, freedom to write, and freedom to vote as the primary values that it was necessary to achieve. And this emancipation was indeed the precondition of all subsequent progress. So when we first started to value the individual, we valued very specific things. We valued voting, we valued freedom of speech, we valued freedom of press. And his argument was, yes, that was good. That was excellent. We needed all of those things. Those things are the foundation for more freedom. The problem with valuing those freedoms was that he thinks they didn't quite push it far enough. He thinks that they got, that amount of freedom and no more. However, carried away by the enthusiasm of the struggle and concerned only with the objective they pursued, in the end they no longer saw beyond it, and they made into something of an ultimate goal what was merely the next stage in their efforts. So he's arguing, yeah, you started off great. Freedom of press, great. Freedom to vote, great. But the problem he thinks is that you didn't push it any further than that. And that's what he wants to do, is continue to value the individual and give rights and give benefits to the individual. Now, political freedom is a means, not an end. It is worth no more than the manner in which it is put to use. If it does not serve something which exists beyond it, it is not merely fruitless, it becomes dangerous. So essentially he's saying we got all of this power, we got all this free speech, we got all these rights to vote, and we're basically doing nothing with it. It's not supposed to be an end. We're not supposed to get the right to vote and then just chill. We're supposed to get the right to vote and then do something, change the world, change the government. He's saying we have all of this freedom, but we are not using it to serve ourselves. We are not using it to push ourselves forward. We are only using it to sort of have freedoms and then just sit there and look at them. So this is what he thinks that we should do. We soon had to admit that no one knew what use should be made of this freedom that had been so laboriously achieved. We must go beyond what has been achieved, if only to preserve it. Let us, therefore, use our freedoms to discover what must be done and in order to do it. And this is one of my favorite sentences. I just think it's so beautiful, this third one. I think it's something that we really need to keep in mind in our current political schema, especially. This idea that we have all of these freedoms and we can't just sit on them. We can't just look at them. We have to use them to push society forward. We have to use, for instance, the freedom to write whatever we want in the press, the freedom to read whatever we want, the freedom to put whatever we want on the internet, to discover what must be done. And then we have to use those freedoms to change. So essentially, we have all of these freedoms and they're wonderful and they're good, but we can't just sit on our laurels. It's time to use them. Let us use them in order to soften the functioning of the social machine, still so harsh to individuals, so as to put at their disposal all possible means for the free development of their faculties in order to finally progress toward making a reality of the famous precept, to each according to his works. So you may recall, to each according to his works is essentially a Marxist idea, this idea, to each according to his needs, from each according to his abilities. So basically he's saying we have to use all these freedoms, we have to use all these rights and make society better. And he calls it the free development of their faculties. So basically education, enlightenment, learning, opportunities, that we have to use the things that we have available to us to soften society and make it better for everybody in a way that values the individual but also makes the society itself stronger. So one example of this, I think, would be the idea that we made education free. Well, I mean, we pay for it with our taxes, but everyone has the right in America to a free education, and there are a lot of scholarships if you want to continue your higher education, and I think that's sort of what he meant by putting at the disposal all possible means, like giving people the opportunity. So this is an example of, how people are always talking about not hand ups, but a leg up, like this idea that we're not going to hand you what you want, but we are going to make it possible for you to get what you want. So this is kind of to wrap this whole little chapter up. We do value the individual. We had recently come to value the individual. Because of valuing the individual, we fought for very specific individual rights, and now we have those rights. But we can't just chill with those rights. We have to push forward. We have to use those rights and specifically with the goal of making society better. Okay. So now we move into the final chapter from this whole sort of review de philosophique, and this one is called The Causes of the Development of the Division of Labor. And this chapter is going to tie everything together. So I know it kind of seems like everything was a little bit random and kind of coming out of nowhere. There's a whole series of ideas, and this is where he sort of weaves it all together into one coherent whole. So he's going to tie together the division of labor, the rise of the individual, and the fracturing of society into a whole different thing. So buckle up. The growth of the division of labor is thus brought about by the social segments losing their individuality, as the boundaries between them become less marked. In short, a merging takes place, which makes it possible for social life to enter into new combinations. So here he's talking about what happens when we move to the city. The division of labor and the rise of factories essentially meant that we all became a little bit different, and we all began having different skills and different abilities, and because of that, we no longer all look the same. Instead, we are sort of merging. We need other people now, and sometimes those other people don't look like us, they don't have the same religion as us, they come from a different place than us, but we are merging. We're becoming sort of like a salad. Like, it's not that we are all blending together like a soup, it's more like we are separate but all in the same bowl now. It produces a coming together between individuals who were separated, or at least a closer relationship than existed previously. Consequently, there is an interchange of action between parts of the social mass, which until then had no effect upon one another. So Essentially, people who never would have met each other are suddenly now meeting. People who previously thought they had nothing in common are suddenly now hanging out. They're suddenly useful to each other. My personal favorite celebrity friendship is right here, Martha Stewart and Snoop Dogg. There's no reason to believe that they would get along, but as it turns out, they do. They both love, mashed potatoes and cooking things, and it turns out that they can get along and provide something useful to one another. So what he's saying is, as we come together, people who previously thought they had nothing in common, as it turns out, do have things in common, and their interchange can be totally useful for both sides. Social life, instead of being concentrated in a large number of separate small centers, each of which resembles the other, is generalized. Social relations, or more correctly, intrasocial relations, consequently become more numerous since they extend on all sides beyond their original limits. So, again, we used to be concentrated in little towns spread out all around the country, but now we are beginning to mix together. And we are not becoming homogenized, but instead we are sort of keeping what makes us unique and bringing that uniqueness to the table, so to speak. This picture is from Breakfast Club, which is before your time, but you should still watch it. And it's sort of this idea that even though we are all very different, even though we are burnouts and jocks and goths and princesses and nerds, we can come together and do something sort of beautiful and original that benefits all of us. The division of labor develops, therefore, as there are more individuals sufficiently in contact to be able to act and react upon one another. If we agree to call this coming together and the act of commerce resulting from it, quote, dynamic or, quote, formal density, we can say that the progress of the division of labor is in direct ratio to the moral or dynamic density of society. So he's arguing that as we come together, our division of labor rises. So he's saying there's essentially a direct correlation. So the closer together we live, the more division of labor we have. So this street is one of my favorite streets in Atlanta. This is Broad Street downtown, and there's a whole bunch of stuff, sort of all smushed together. There's not, a restaurant. This isn't like a town that has one Waffle House. There's all sorts of different things, and there's all sorts of people living upstairs from those restaurants, and there's all sorts of people living in the blocks nearby those restaurants. And there's this idea that as we become more densely populated, we become more differentiated in our labor. So like we don't need just one person to do the cooking anymore. We need lots of people to do different cooking. We need some people to make noodles and some people to make sushi and some people to make pizza. So we sort of begin to branch out the closer we get together because we need that division of labor. So he lists 3 ways that society tends to condense, because remember, he's super into science. He's trying to bring the scientific method to social sciences. So he's really into numbering things and labeling them. So these are the 3 ways that he lists, and of course we'll talk about each 3. Number 1, literal physical nearness. Number 2, the formation of towns, the sort of like intentional formation of towns. And number 3, means of communication and transportation. So start with number 1, location. Whereas lower societies are spread over immense areas relative to the size of their population, among more advanced peoples, population tends to become more and more concentrated. So this is, kind of maybe a little low-key racist, but his argument is basically in less advanced societies, people live far apart. They have, farms, they don't really know each other, they have to all do all of the labor. But in a, quote, more advanced society, which is, as time progresses, as people get more technology, they tend to kind of scoot closer together. So our population literally becomes concentrated in certain areas. The map here below is essentially a representation of how population is concentrated all across the world. So this is a very big picture version of that, but I think it's a good illustration of the way that we do concentrate humanity in certain small areas and then leave other areas completely alone. This is an example of how quickly this sort of thing happened. So bear in mind, Durkheim is writing right as this is beginning to take off, right here. So for a couple hundred years, of course there were towns and of course there were cities, but they weren't that big. There weren't really that many of them. But right around the 1850s, right around the Industrial Revolution, people started to really urbanize. People started to really move into the small places. So you can see that in America, we sort of led that charge. And other countries did it a little bit later. Remember how in class we were talking about how China didn't really experience their industrial revolution until later? This is kind of an example of that. So the sooner you industrialize, the sooner you start to value cities and move into cities. Speaking of which, the next thing that he talks about is towns. So you can't just kind of move in all willy-nilly and build like a little ramshackle, town with no design, cough Atlanta. But instead, you have to sort of intentionally move together because you need each other. Towns always result from the need of individuals to put themselves constantly in the closest possible contact with each other. So his argument here is if we need each other, we want to be close to each other. Like for instance, if you need to like pop into the store, you don't want to have to drive 45 minutes. You want to like walk around the corner. As long as social organization is essentially segmental, towns do not exist. So if you don't know your neighbors, if you don't need your neighbors, you don't need a town. What are you going to do in a town? The constantly increasing acceleration of this development proves that, far from constituting a sort of pathological phenomenon, it comes from the very nature of higher social types. So he's trying to argue that the formation of towns is natural, but he's also arguing that people who don't form towns are like less developed. Again, this is sort of low-key hateful, but he's essentially arguing that, quote, higher social types form towns as a matter of fact because they want to come together, they want to share the division of labor, and lower social types stay farther away from each other. So he's saying it's not the people who gather together that are wrong. Those people are correct. It's the people who stay far apart that are wrong. So the forming of towns is not pathological, it's normal. Finally, we get to communication and transportation. Finally, there are the number and rapidity of the means of communication and transportation. By suppressing or diminishing the gaps which separate social segments, they increase the density of society. So essentially, if you want to go to the town, you need a means to get to the town. And if there is a means to get to the town, more people will go to the town. So I think one way to think about this is like commuting. Not everybody lives in the city, but a lot of people work in the city, so they have to use these means of transportation to get to the city. So the more trains and buses you have, the more people will come to your city itself. So it's sort of a chicken egg situation. Like you can't get to the city without a road, but the more roads you build, the more people will come to the city. So essentially having the means to get there, very important. And then of course having communication, like knowing that the city exists, knowing that there are good things there is also very important. So knowing that you can go to the city. So essentially having the means of communicating where the city is and what's in it, very important. Having the means of literally going to the city, also very important. So the next thing he does, now that he has argued that we're all in cities and we're all happy in cities, is to begin delving into the division of labor. So with all of these people in the city, we don't need everybody to do the same job. That would have no value to us. So what we end up doing is dividing and dividing and dividing. So he says, if work becomes progressively divided as societies become more voluminous and dense, it is not because external circumstances are more varied, but because the struggle for existence is more acute. So essentially, as people move into the city, we don't need 50 butchers. We need, 1 or 2 butchers, and then the other people need to do something else. Like there's a sort of density issue here. So when people move to the city, it's not that city people need different things. It's not that their circumstances are more varied. It's just that you can't get a job doing something that everybody else is already doing. So you have to be creative. You got to branch out. And I think the gig economy is a great example of this. Living in a town, or even especially in a city, there's a lot of weird jobs that people want. Sometimes people want you to pick up fast food and bring it to them, or people want you to drive them to the airport, or people want you to walk their dog while they're at work. And these are very like city-specific jobs. You don't necessarily hire somebody in the country to bring you takeout because maybe there's not takeout, and also it would take them an hour and a half. So this idea that there are various jobs in the city is really interesting, is this sort of foresight that he was looking forward into the future and seeing that you would need to be creative if you wanted to figure out what to buy and what to sell. And essentially, this is supply and demand. And he never used these terms. I assume he studied economics at some point, but he still didn't use these terms specifically. But that's essentially what he's talking about. So he flashes back to Darwin, which I think is interesting. Darwin quite correctly observed that the struggle between two organisms is as active as they are similar. So Darwin was talking about this idea that if, for instance, two birds want to eat the same worm, they're going to fight over that worm. It's going to be an active struggle. But if one bird wants to eat a worm and one bird wants to eat a berry, then they're not going to fight because they are no longer similar. So humans have to kind of do the same thing. Men obey the same law. In the city, different occupations can coexist without being obliged mutually to destroy one another, for they pursue different objectives. The closer functions approach one another, however, the more points of contact they have, and the more, consequently, they are exposed to conflict. So when he's talking about the division of labor, he's not necessarily talking about breaking one task into several different parts. He's talking about everybody doing a different task. So here, when he's talking about, for instance, different occupations might be mutually obliged to destroy each other, he's saying if you had two bakeries next door to one another, they would be obliged to mutually destroy each other. Like, how would you choose which one to go to? You know, one bakery wouldn't have like an advantage over another bakery. But if you had a butcher shop next to a bakery, that would be okay because they're selling two different things. So you would go to the butcher and buy some meat, you would go to the baker and buy some bread, like no problem. So I imagine you've thought about this kind of thing before. Like if you see an empty storefront, you're not going to put the same store next to it. That would be silly. Although, of course, we do this in Atlanta all the time. This picture on the right is an example of a mattress firm across the street from a mattress firm. And on the left, we see a Starbucks across the street from a Starbucks. So those aren't going to both survive. Or for sure, the mattress ones won't. The Starbucks might. But he's essentially saying when we differentiate our labor, one of the things we have to differentiate is what we sell. Unless you have a distinct advantage over the other stores around you, you need to be selling something different than the other stores around you. So this supply and demand issue is very similar to animals hunting for the same game, except that it's essentially customers hunting for the same game. And if you want your store to be the best store, you better be selling something unique. So, this having been said, it is easy to understand that any condensation of the social mass, especially if it is accompanied by an increase in population, necessarily stimulates an advance in the division of labor. So the more we come together, the more we need to differentiate our labor. The more you come together, you get more people, and they need more things. Like there's room for the differentiation of labor, but you have to be thoughtful about what you provide. Because we're all very interdependent, but you still have to provide something that people need and something that people want. And here he rephrases it one last time. If society in concentrating determines the development of the division of labor, the latter in its turn increases the concentration of society. So essentially they have acted upon each other. So the individuality of the person is valuable, the rights and freedoms of the person are valuable, and the individual job that person chooses to undertake, the individual process that they provide for humanity is valuable. So as we come together, we get more and more concentrated as humans, but we get more and more divided as laborers in terms of the work that we do. And he says, that is all we wish to prove. Nailed it.